Police believe that this was some sort of personal dispute. In this shooting, one student is dead, another critically injured. The student who survived this shooting is currently in the hospital, said to be in stable condition. As for the suspect, he is not a student, according to authorities. Authorities arresting Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville, Indiana, charging him with murder and first-degree assault. This all happened Tuesday afternoon on campus near a dorm. All classes have been canceled for the rest of the week as the investigation is still ongoing. But again, police say there is no...
You just watched something that should shake you to your very foundations. And if it doesn't, then I need you to ask yourself what exactly has happened to your moral compass. Because what we're seeing unfold right now in real time is not some distant abstraction about policy debates or some wonkish discussion about the limits of executive power. What we are witnessing is the mechanics of state murder being carried out with American missiles under the authority of an administration that has decided the laws of war no longer apply to its operations. And here's the thing that should absolutely terrify you beyond measure. They won't even let us see the proof of what they did. Representative Jim Himes watched that classified footage and said, "Any American who sees the video that I saw will see the United States military attacking shipwrecked sailors." And this is a lawmaker who has seen countless classified briefings in his career, calling this one of the most troubling things he has ever witnessed in public service. So before we dive into the catastrophic implications of this moment, I need you to understand, we're not talking about some theoretical debate here. We're talking about human beings who clung to the wreckage of their destroyed vessel for roughly 45 minutes before Admiral Frank Bradley ordered a follow-up strike that killed the shipwrecked men, and I want you to think about that temporal reality for just a moment, because 45 minutes is not the fog of war. 45 minutes is not split-second battlefield decision-making. 45 minutes is enough time to order lunch and have it delivered. It's enough time to watch an entire episode of television, and in this case it was enough time for military commanders to watch two human beings desperately clinging to wreckage in the ocean and methodically decide to fire more missiles to finish them off. Now the video that lawmakers finally got to see after weeks of stonewalling shows something that contradicts every single talking point this administration has vomited into the public discourse, because these two survivors were waving overhead before they were killed in the second strike, an action that could be interpreted as either calling for help or trying to wave off another strike. And here's where the moral depravity reaches levels that should make your blood run cold, because even if we accept the administration's framing that these were bad guys involved in drug trafficking, which itself is a designation they've made without trial or due process, there exists in international humanitarian law a principle so fundamental that it dates back centuries, a principle that says when combatants are rendered hors de combat, when they are taken out of the fight through injury or shipwreck or surrender, you cannot execute them. Targeting shipwrecked survivors is against the military's law of war manual, and multiple legal experts have stated this constitutes a war crime. Yet here we have Secretary Pete Hegseth offering excuse after excuse while telling congressional leaders we have to study it. When asked about releasing the full video to Congress, and the sheer audacity of that response should make every single American demand his immediate resignation, because what exactly needs to be studied here? The pattern of lies and obfuscation coming from this administration has been so systematic and so brazen that it reveals something darker than mere incompetence. It reveals a contempt for democratic accountability that borders on authoritarian. Hegseth initially claimed he couldn't see survivors through the smoke and fire, telling reporters he didn't personally see survivors, and evoked the fog of war to justify the strikes, but then lawmakers who actually watched the footage reported that the surveillance video included a zoomed-in, higher-definition view of the two survivors clinging to the capsized portion, and that for 41 minutes Bradley and the command center discussed what to do as they watched the men struggle. So which is it? Was this the fog of war, or was this high-definition surveillance footage showing in crystal clarity two shipwrecked human beings for nearly 3/4 of an hour before the decision was made to kill them? And here's what should absolutely enrage you, Hegseth then claimed he was told there had to be a reattack because there were folks who could still be in the fight with access to radios, and there was a link-up point of another potential boat. But Admiral Bradley acknowledged in congressional briefings that the two survivors were in no position to make a distress call. Representative Adam Smith, who was briefed on the video, said there were no radios and called Hegseth's description ridiculous. So we have the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America fabricating justifications for extrajudicial killings, and when caught in that fabrication, simply moving on to the next excuse. But here's where this gets even more sinister, and I need you to pay attention, because this is where we see the architecture of impunity being constructed in real time. The Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel produced a classified opinion intended to shield service members up and down the chain of command from prosecution. advancing a legal theory that narcotics on boats are lawful military targets because their cargo generates revenue for cartels whom the Trump administration claims are in armed conflict with the U.S. And do you understand what this means? This administration has created a secret legal framework that allows them to designate civilians as combatants, to declare drug smugglers as enemy forces in a war that Congress never authorized, and then to execute them without trial in international waters. And when confronted with evidence that one of these strikes involved what appears to be clear violations of international law, they simply classify the evidence and refuse to release it. This is not how democracies function. This is how authoritarian regimes function, and the fact that advocacy groups, including the ACLU, are now suing the Trump administration demanding release of these legal memos with attorneys stating, "The public deserves to know how our government is justifying the cold-blooded murder of civilians as lawful," should tell you everything about how far we have fallen. The sheer hypocrisy is staggering when you consider that this is the same administration that posts edited propaganda videos to social media showing boats exploding. Trump posted an edited clip to Truth Social on September 2 announcing the strike, and Trump had posted video of the initial strike before reporting emerged of the second strike. So they will gleefully broadcast images of death and destruction when it serves their political narrative, but when the unedited footage would reveal the moral horror of what they've done, suddenly everything becomes classified. Senator Mark Warner called it a little strange for officials to claim full unedited video is classified and cannot be released even to members of Congress. After they've been posting strike videos constantly, and let's talk about Trump's role in this catastrophe, because the man who initially said, "I don't know what they have, but whatever they have, we'd certainly release, no problem," then performed a complete reversal, with a notable shift from the president insisting he never said he would release the full video, and telling reporters whatever Pete Hegseth wants to do is okay with me, which is exactly the kind of responsibility-dodging cowardice we've come to expect from this administration, claiming credit when things go well, and distancing himself the moment accountability comes calling. What we're watching here is not just a single incident of potential war crimes, we're watching the systematic dismantling of the very framework of laws and norms that are supposed to constrain American military power, because this strike was the first of the administration's campaign that has now grown to more than 20 strikes killing more than 80 people, and at least 5 people have survived initial strikes ending up in the water. But what happened next varied greatly, with 2 detained and returned to their countries, 1 left to float and presumed dead, and 2 killed in the September 20 secondary strike, which means the administration doesn't even have a consistent policy for dealing with survivors. They're literally making it up as they go along. A New York Times report revealed Defense Department lawyers suggested taking 2 survivors to a notorious mega prison in El Salvador, with the goal of avoiding having survivors end up in the U.S. justice system, because they know if these cases were subjected to actual legal scrutiny, their entire framework would collapse. This is lawlessness masquerading as national security. This is murder masquerading as counter-narcotics operations, and the fact that the administration is conducting these strikes without authorization from Congress represents a usurpation of war powers that should have every constitutionalist in this country demanding immediate action regardless of their political affiliation. Let me be absolutely clear about what the legal experts are saying here, because this isn't some partisan squabble over policy preferences. Former Pentagon advisor Sarah Harrison, who specialized in human rights and law of war, stated, "They didn't pose an imminent threat to U.S. forces or the lives of others. There was no lawful justification to kill them in the first place, let alone the second strike," and she emphasized the only allegation was that the men were transporting drugs, a crime that doesn't even carry the death penalty, which gets to the heart of why this is so fundamentally un-American, because we don't execute people for drug trafficking, even within our own borders where we actually have jurisdiction and due process. Yet somehow in international waters we've decided summary execution is appropriate. Experts in the laws of war and members of Congress from both parties have described the strikes as illegal extrajudicial killings because the military is not permitted to deliberately target civilians who do not pose an imminent threat of violence, and throughout the entire history of the war on drugs, law enforcement agencies have arrested suspected drug smugglers rather than relying on summary executions. So what changed? What changed is we now have an administration that believes it can declare anyone anywhere an enemy combatant and obliterate them with American military hardware without any oversight or accountability. The congressional response has been revealing in ways that should deeply alarm anyone who cares about the future of democratic governance, because while Democrats have been nearly unanimous in their horror at what they witnessed, Senator Tom Cotton said the 4 strikes were entirely lawful and needful, and they were exactly what we'd expect our military commanders to do. and Cotton claimed he saw 2 survivors trying to flip a boat loaded with drugs bound for the United States back over so they could stay in the fight, which is such a transparent attempt to reframe defenseless shipwrecked individuals as active combatants that it would be laughable if the stakes weren't literally life and death. Meanwhile, even Republican Representative Mike Turner said he was concerned because if the survivors had been captured and convicted, they would be put in jail, not subject to capital punishment. So we have a rare moment of bipartisan acknowledgement that something deeply wrong happened here. Yet the machinery of Republican partisanship is still working overtime to provide cover for what increasingly looks like state-sponsored murder. And the fact that Senator Rand Paul is sponsoring legislation stating these follow-on strikes of people who are wounded in the ocean is really against our code of military justice. They are illegal. Shows that even some Republicans are finally recognizing the constitutional crisis unfolding before us. Now let's talk about what this means for the broader erosion of governmental transparency and accountability, because this incident is happening within a larger context of an administration that has shown absolute contempt for public oversight. And I need you to understand that Congress has tucked into their massive defense policy bill a provision that would limit Hegseth's travel budget unless he provides the Armed Services Committees with unedited video of the strikes, which is an extraordinary step that demonstrates just how serious this breach of trust has become. When Congress has to essentially threaten the Secretary of Defense with budget restrictions to get him to share evidence of potential war crimes with the very body constitutionally charged with oversight of military operations, we have crossed into authoritarian territory, and the historical parallels here should chill you to the bone because this is exactly how democratic backsliding happens. Not with dramatic coups, but with the gradual erosion of accountability mechanisms, until suddenly you wake up and realize your government is operating in total darkness, committing acts that would be unthinkable in a functioning democracy. The way this administration has manipulated information and narrative around these strikes reveals a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain plausible deniability while still projecting strength to their base. They release the propaganda footage of explosions to satisfy the bloodlust of their supporters who want to see Trump being tough on cartels, but they withhold the footage that would humanize the victims and reveal the moral bankruptcy of the operation. Representative Adam Smith said we had video for 48 minutes of 2 guys hanging off the side of a boat. There was plenty of time to make a clear and sober analysis, which destroys any possible argument about split-second decision-making under battlefield conditions. Smith's account of the classified video describes 2 men sitting without shirts atop a portion of capsized boat, which is about as far from an active combatant as you can possibly imagine. Yet the administration's argument, according to Smith, was that the 2 men were still deemed to be in the fight because there could have been still transmittable drugs in the capsized wrecked boat, and those 2 men could have continued with their delivery, which is such a preposterous legal theory that it essentially means anyone in proximity to contraband can be summarily executed regardless of whether they pose any threat whatsoever. Here's what keeps me up at night about all of this. We're watching in real time the normalization of extrajudicial killing by the American government, and the partisan polarization is so extreme that a significant portion of the country will simply accept whatever justification they're given because the targets have been designated as bad guys and narco-terrorists. Even though Representative Himes stated, there is no such thing as a narco-terrorist, and apparently we have enough evidence to kill these people, but we don't have enough evidence to try them in a court of law, which should make everyone pause and reflect on what kind of precedent we're setting here. If the government can declare drug traffickers to be enemy combatants in an undeclared war and execute them without trial in international waters, what's to stop them from expanding that framework? What's to stop a future administration from deciding that domestic criminals involved in drug distribution are enemy combatants? What's to stop them from deciding that protesters or dissidents or journalists who threaten national security are legitimate targets? Once you abandon the framework of law and due process, once you accept that the executive can simply designate people for death based on secret intelligence and secret legal memos, you have dismantled the very foundations of constitutional governance. The fact that Admiral Bradley told lawmakers the struck boat planned to rendezvous with a vessel bound for Suriname, and that he argued the drug shipment could have made its way from Suriname to the U.S., justifying striking the boat even if it wasn't directly heading to U.S. shores, shows how infinitely expandable this logic becomes. Because if you can justify killing people based on the possibility that drugs they're transporting might eventually, through multiple transfers, end up in America, then you can justify killing literally anyone anywhere in the supply chain, based purely on speculation about future harm. This is the logic of totalitarianism dressed up in the language of national security. And the most horrifying part is watching how effectively it's working on a population that has been primed through decades of war on terror rhetoric, to accept extraordinary government power in the name of keeping us safe. What we need right now more than anything is a full reckoning with what has been done in our name. We need those videos released to the public, not just to Congress. We need every legal memo justifying these operations made public with appropriate redactions for genuine national security concerns. We need independent investigations by international human rights organizations. We need congressional hearings with sworn testimony and consequences for perjury. And we need impeachment proceedings if it's determined that Hegseth or others in the chain of command violated the laws of war. But more than that, we need to have a national conversation about what kind of country we want to be, because right now we're at a crossroads where we can either demand accountability and reaffirm our commitment to the rule of law and human rights, even when it's inconvenient or politically uncomfortable, or we can accept that American power is beyond constraint and that our government can kill anyone it designates as an enemy without meaningful oversight. And if we choose the latter, then we need to stop pretending we're a democracy governed by laws, because we will have become something else entirely, something that our founders would have recognized as tyranny, and that future historians will look back on with the same moral horror we reserve for the darkest chapters of human history. The silence from so many quarters is deafening and complicity masquerading as pragmatism. And I'm not interested in hearing about political realities or electability concerns when we're talking about the United States military potentially committing war crimes. I'm not interested in the both-sidesism that tries to equate democratic concerns about extrajudicial killing with Republican conspiracy theories. I'm not interested in the cynical calculation that this won't move voters, so why spend political capital on it? What I'm interested in is living in a country where the government cannot murder people in secret and then hide the evidence behind classification. What I'm interested in is a military bound by the laws of war that apply to every other nation on Earth. What I'm interested in is a Congress that will exercise its constitutional duty to check executive power regardless of which party holds the White House. And if we can't achieve that bare minimum standard, then we need to acknowledge that the American experiment in democratic self-governance has failed, and that we're now just haggling over the terms of our descent into authoritarianism, and that's not hyperbole, that's not alarmism, that's a clear-eyed assessment of what it means when your government claims the authority to kill without due process, and then threatens and stonewalls anyone who demands accountability. So when you watch that clip and you hear lawmakers saying they saw defenseless shipwrecked people waving before they were killed, when you hear Hegseth saying they need to study it more before releasing footage that Trump himself initially said would be released no problem, when you see the pattern of lies and shifting justifications and obstruction of oversight, I need you to feel something beyond partisan frustration. I need you to feel the moral weight of what's being done in our name with our tax dollars by our military. I need you to feel the urgency of this moment when the framework of international humanitarian law and democratic accountability is being systematically dismantled. And I need you to channel that feeling into sustained pressure on every representative and senator, regardless of party, to demand full transparency and accountability, because this isn't about left versus right. This is about whether we're going to be a nation of laws or a nation where power answers to no one. The victims of these strikes cannot speak for themselves anymore. They're dead, killed by American missiles, in what increasingly appears to be a violation of every moral and legal principle we claim to stand for. So we have to speak for them. We have to demand justice, not because it's politically convenient, but because if we don't, if we let this slide into the memory hole of yet another Trump administration scandal that gets superseded by the next outrage, then we will have lost something essential about what it means to be human, and what it means to believe in justice, and what it means to live in a democracy, and I refuse to accept that outcome without a fight.